So we will now move into our workshop about the Anti-Racism Network and its Justice Committee. And this conversation is going to be a compelling one. For the first half, our speakers are going to start with a more conceptual discussion, understanding what systemic racism is and how it manifests in the justice system and impacts vulnerable people in our community. And then we'll have time for questions and answers and some discussion. And then for the second half of the session, the speakers and I will discuss how the Anti-Racism Network was formed here in Saskatoon and what it's doing in response to the problem of systemic racism in various systems, including justice. And but our focus today, of course, will be justice. And then there will be time for your questions and comments again. And this conversation is dear to my heart as I represent MCC and serve alongside the panelists on the network and in the committee. So I'll be a little more involved than a moderator normally would. So now it's my pleasure to introduce two amazing people to you who I love working with and I'm grateful to call friends. Becky Saskatchewan is a band member of Attack-a-Coop Cree Nation. Since 2008, Becky has been employed as the Cultural Diversity and Race Relations Consultant for the City of Saskatoon and as an anti-racism practitioner. Previous to that, Becky worked for the federal and provincial governments. Becky has a Bachelor of Arts, a Bachelor of Education, and a Master's of Education. She is an active member of Saskatoon's urban Indigenous community and volunteers on various boards of directors, most recently the Legacy Ridge Foundation. She currently lives in Saskatoon with her partner and their 11-year-old daughter. And at MCC, our staff had the benefit of receiving anti-racism education from Becky a couple of years ago. She did a session with us, and we are grateful to work with her in a number of capacities. I also am pleased to welcome Sydney Woiters. Sydney is a young woman born and raised in Saskatchewan, living in both North Battleford and Saskatoon growing up. As she was growing up, Sydney completed her Bachelor of Social Work Sydney's all grown up, and she completed her Bachelor of Social Work in 2019. Following her education, Sydney went and worked in child protection, and she is currently the social worker and prison in-reach worker at the Elizabeth Fry Society of Saskatchewan. In these roles, Sydney has seen the barriers and systematic injustices and racism that women, girls, and members of the LGBTQ Two-Spirit Plus communities face in our government systems. Sydney is passionate about working with women, youth, and children, and hope to see a future where systematic barriers are not something we have to deal with. So welcome, Becky and Sydney. We're looking forward to learning from you today.
Thank you so much. So I think I'm up first in the agenda, and I will just make sure that I can share my screen. Can we all see this where it says systemic racism in the justice system? Good so far? Okay, so I just want to spend a tiny bit of time introducing myself. I am part of the 60s scoop. So folks, I think generally have an understanding that the 60s scoop was part of the movement that took children away from their families to be raised in white homes. And it was a practice that actually, continued right into the 90s. So I was raised in a home where both of my parents were white, and they were lovely, wonderful people, and I am grateful for that. And a lot of the education that I had growing up in my family really contributed to the way it is that I thought about a lot of the things that I saw around me, and overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the justice system was one of them. So early in my career, I actually joined the RCMP. So it was my first professional job that I had was as an RCMP member. And then I went on to finish a bachelor's degree and then a master's degree later on. And then it wasn't until then that some of the incongruencies in the way that I learned to believe about things about the justice system, there was some light that was shone on that. So I grew up thinking, in a very conservative, middle class farming family, rural farming community in southern Saskatchewan, that if you committed a crime, then you've revoked your privilege of belonging to society. But as an Indigenous person, some of the stories, some of the narratives, the systemic narratives that I learned just did not seem to be able to make sense to me. And so, throughout the time that I was in the RCMP and then actually later pursuing, a master's degree, I focused on the justice system. Specifically, I was interested in the first point of contact, which was policing, but then also definitely, the judiciary or the courts and the law, and then also the correctional system. So when I started looking into this whole idea, we often hear the overrepresentation of Indigenous people, and in the prairies, namely Manitoba and Saskatchewan, given that we only have a 14%, and these statistics were taken from 2020, so they're not that old. So we have an overrepresentation of Indigenous people when the population of Saskatchewan is 14% Indigenous, but yet 75% of the correctional facilities are Indigenous. We know that systemic and institutionalized racism is a problem, and they are often, represented in charts like this. There are numerous statistics that are available to be able to show us the trajectory that we are on is quite concerning, that the overrepresentation of Indigenous people within correctional centers. And often when we're looking at doing the research, we see explanations of overrepresentation of First Nations people in the justice system that we need to look at personal racism or interpersonal racism, systemic racism, and ideological racism, or cultural and institutional racism. And so we need to look at these three different forms of racism in policing and in the courts and laws and in corrections. And so this makes a lot of sense to us. And I used to think that, and we hear this often when I was a police officer, that, the law is neutral and objective, and then therefore it was only a few bad apples. And we hear this often when we're talking about some of the terrible incidents that have happened in Saskatoon regarding police officers, and then often lawyers and judges maybe. And then guards and in corrections. And so there's a few bad apples that really infect the overall system. And that, is relatively easy to believe when we look at how it is that we, have been, taught to think of what our national identity of Canadians is. We're very peace loving, we're very polite. That's what our national identity is. And so I used to think that and believe that as well. Until I started, looking into understanding racism, not only from, an Indigenous perspective, because when I was growing up, I, was a good student. I didn't have a propensity to commit more crime. Like, I always had a job. I always, did really well in school. And so there was a lot of incongruencies of, the narratives, of Indigenous people, committing high rates of crime, high rates of substance abuse, the criminal activities, antisocial activity is what it's referred to often, in policing circles. So I used to think all of those things until I started doing research at the master's level into systemic and institutionalized racism, and started to look at, the creation of policies that contributed to our national identity and the health and welfare state in Canada. And so what do those early policies, how did those early policies contribute not only to our current state in justice, but also our current state, I would say, in all of our social structures: justice, health, education, environment, business, and sport. They have all been mentioned in the TRC calls to action. So what are these early policies, and how did they contribute to Canada as a nation and our national identity and the health and welfare that we see that are represented in the statistics in all of our social structures? So if we look at Canada is a colonized country. I think more and more people are starting to realize that Canada is a colonized country. And when we start to understand colonization as not only an event, but as a movement in Canada, we can begin to understand and find some shortcomings with some of the frameworks that we have used to be able to address systemic racism traditionally within the justice system. A lot of times we look at the fact that, well, we just need to be able to have more police officers, because police officers will then, look at their own in terms of the overrepresentation of Indigenous people who are charged and then enter the court system. And so then, well, if we had more judges, then there would be more understanding. There would be less of a language barrier, there would be less of a cultural barrier in understanding justice, and then therefore the sentencing may be more appropriate considering these, cultural relations or the relatability. And so therefore it was just a matter of representation until we look at the nature of colonization and what that has actually done in the formalization in public policy within Canada. So Canada is a colonized country. Through the processes of the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, more and more people are beginning to realize colonization and what the purpose of colonization was. And colonization is the event of a policy where people came to occupy the land, right? So in Canada, colonization was a process of being able to dispossess Indigenous people of the land and resources. And so when we look at some of the conceptions of colonization, we understand that colonization depends upon white supremacy, male supremacy, and human supremacy, and in combination with capitalism, so resources for profit. And so if we understand that the formulation of public policy is based on these particular ideas, we can understand the nature of the legacy of the creation of Canada. And this was a quote from John A. Macdonald in 1879, who was the architect of the Indian Act and also residential schools. And this is the Canadian legacy in the formation of our country, that really looks at extinguishing Indigenous right or Indigenous existence through a number of different policies for social and welfare policies, and specifically for the purposes of access to the land. So if we look at if we look at the land that was occupied at the beginning of contact to where we are now, we see that there is a significant reduction in the amount of Indigenous people who are occupying the land and have access to the land and resources. So settler colonialism is an ongoing form of colonization that is ultimately at the heart of the original policy of the health and safety and welfare of Canada. So what is the welfare state and what is the origins of the welfare state and who was it actually for? So the social safety net, providing a base level of health and welfare, keeps a population that is ready for work and war, stabilizes a capitalist system, and is reinforced by a national identity. And so our national identity in Canada is formulated by multiple different ideas. And we formulate this idea of Canada as being the North Star, right? That we were, the escape from slavery from Blacks in the United States. And so we don't, we differentiate ourselves from, the atrocities of slavery and racism in the United States because we were, we were people who, valued peace and freedom. And that is built into our national identity. But when we look at the policies and how the welfare state was formed, there's a number of different policies that we can look at that were very positive in creating a national identity that was around peace and welfare and stability and economic attachment and those types of policies. But who were these policies for is what it's important to be able to look at. And so these policies mainly were for heterosexual, patriarchal, nuclear white families to be able to reproduce. So when we look at the policies that, that were made, for settler population, it naturalizes hierarchical relations. the space that is taken up, or the occupation of the land and the use of the land. And I was raised in a in a farming community, and my grandfather actually came to Saskatchewan to pioneer and to settle the land in the early 1900s. And he worked very hard to be able to create a good life for his family. And he brought, relatives here, and, some of their children died. And, he did work very hard. And I was raised with some of those stories about how difficult it was to be able to come here from another country, with $11 in his pocket. And that's what, how I understand, his tie to the land, that he left a country, where he was a gardener because he could come to Canada and be a landowner. And he did work incredibly hard. And back then he worked with horses. So he pioneered his homestead with horses, and has all of these incredible stories, of, work ethic and clearing the land, and, being grateful to the land. And I remember hearing all of these stories. And so in the prairies, particularly, it is important to be able to understand that strong tie, that settlers and settler families do have to the land. And it's also important when we're looking at trying to understand the unequal representation of Indigenous population in positive statistics like attachment to the labor market, graduation from high schools and universities, but also the overrepresentation of Indigenous people, that are incarcerated, and the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in unequal health care outcomes. So it's important to look at how these policies created our national identity. And in other words, who did they produce Canada to be? Who did they produce that was based on creation of wealth, of intergenerational wealth, and of access to health, and access to wealth, and access to justice? So how did policies work to be able to create this national identity that we are all so proud of? And I am extremely proud to be, in Canada, and to be born in Canada, and extremely grateful for that. But meanwhile, what we also have to understand is that there was an incredible amount of policy that worked to be able to create unequal outcomes for Indigenous people. And residential schools were constructed as being there to save and to educate Indigenous people, whereas child apprehension policies were there to save children from bad mothers. And when we look, this is adapted from a paper that was written by a friend of mine for the Center of Policy Alternatives that looks at We Built a Life from Nothing. And she is of Norwegian descent, farming community in southern Saskatchewan as well, over by kind of Yorkton-ish area. And it's a comparison of the rights that were afforded to the white settlers that came here from Europe, as opposed to the Indigenous people, and the policies that created a reproduction of Indigenous people and Indigenous identity. And the outcomes that they have created have produced these hugely disproportionate outcomes. And so when we look at not only just for Indigenous people, but for immigrant populations as well, that instead of racialization for citizenship, there was taxation, and that created a barrier to access to services. And so this is just an example: the Chinese head tax and Japanese internment that have created barriers for equal outcomes and participation within Canada, and Canada as it was being settled and developed in this process of ongoing colonization. And so, access to health and access to justice created this different identity, these forms of identity of who it is that we were, and they were strongly represented within all of the systems. And so we learned this, and our systems were created based on these policies, and how those policies were producing different identities, of a white settler identity, of an immigrant identity, and of an Indigenous identity. And what we often don't talk about a lot is how can we authentically work to be able to challenge these disproportionate outcomes that we see between and in the prairies, mainly Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, it's between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people. But when we're looking at other areas, like in Toronto, for example, it's the Black population. Young Black men are being incarcerated at far higher rates than European settlers or white settlers within the criminal justice system. And you'll notice that I said justice system in quotations at the beginning, because often it's a legal system that isn't necessarily tied to what all conceptions of justice are. And when we're looking at colonization as being one of the single most, having the single most negative impact upon Indigenous people, and the justice system being one of those arms of government that used to be able to create more access to the land for certain portions of the population at the expense of others, we begin to understand that worldview plays a significant role in the conception of how it is, or in the framework that we need to be able to authentically work towards addressing these hugely disproportionate numbers. So diversity and inclusion is often used as a way of being able to say we need to have higher representation of Indigenous police officers, of Indigenous lawyers, of Indigenous judges, and of Indigenous jail guards. But if we understand before contact that Indigenous people had conceptions of justice that had absolutely nothing to do with corrections or nothing to do with punishment, and that justice in an Indigenous worldview was really based on ideas of balance and healing and teaching. And so the systems now that are being imposed upon Indigenous people through the processes of colonization and ongoing colonial ideology are ultimately structurally and inherently dismissive of original conceptions of justice that Indigenous people were living and used to govern themselves prior to European contact. So if we look at the idea of diversity and inclusion, it's not an adequate framework for us to be able to address the inherently culturally racist nature that is producing some of these disproportionate outcomes that we see within justice. And so why we look at then this history is significant is because I used to think that. I used to think that it was just a few bad apples. But when we look at learning the unequal history that has produced these results and unequal circumstances for Black, Indigenous people of color, then we begin to understand that we need not just a framework that is based on diversity and inclusion, but we almost need to look at a complete overhaul of how it is that those formulations of justice can be achieved. I think taking into consideration not just the system of justice that was brought with Europeans and was developed along with the development of Canada as a country, but that we need to start to renounce those ideas of supremacy. We need to call in to question what does justice actually mean? Because I don't think that if we really were to have a conversation about it, that justice means meting out punishment. And we often assume now that when we hear justice has been served, that it means that somebody has gotten a harsh sentence and that somehow our sense of internal justice or revenge has been served through that. That if we were to have conversations about truly what justice is and how do we as human beings arrive at a place of justice, that most likely would not be it. But there are no real ways for us to be able to have those conversations in significant, meaningful ways. But one of the areas that we have been given some guidance is to look at the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action that call provincial, territorial, and municipal governments, and these are the governments, provincial and federal, territorial, who have, the power and the ability to be able to create these discussions about how do we create a framework that is authentic and meaningful and effective in creating more equitable outcomes when it comes to the application of justice. And, the differences of using a cultural competence or using a diversity and inclusion framework as opposed to cultural safety, which incorporates an anti-racist methodology, is that we can look at, very compassionate, intentions that everyone deserves access to justice. But justice means fairness and dignity and respect. And that we have an obligation then when we're looking at what does treatment look like when you're in police custody, when you're in remand, when you're being arrested? What does access to justice look like? What does treatment look like when you are in an institution? And how do some of these, less laudable ways of being able to achieve justice in terms of, extracting a pound of flesh, because if you've done wrong, then you deserve to, be in jail. I used to think like that until I started looking, deeper into, like I said, some of the policies that have created the situation that, has a very strong, what is our Canadian identity? But who were those policies meant for? So I could go on and talk about this for an incredibly long time, but I do, want to be able to share this time not only with my colleague who also has some incredibly valuable information, but I also want to leave time for questions. So I will stop there and be very willing to answer any questions or provide any additional information later on.
Thank you, Becky. I think Sydney has a presentation now.
Okay, let's see. Okay. Okay, can you guys see my screen? Slideshow? Perfect. Okay. So today I wanted to look at the harms of the justice system using an anti-racism lens. So to do that, I thought I would share a story of a woman that I work with on a daily basis. Some things have been changed, her name, but this is her story and her walking through the justice system. So we have Jasmine, who she's currently 24 years old. She has been in and out of incarceration since she was 14. She grew up in a family of poverty, and many of her family members were a part of the residential schools, including both of her parents. She's the first generation that did not go to residential schools in her family. So growing up, she had lots of people looking down on her because her parents were struggled with addiction. They were often couch surfing, and she had little to no healthy supports in the community as well as in her family. Her father has been in and out of incarceration over the past several years. She was recently arrested once again, and she's wanting to make a change for herself because she recently found out she is pregnant. So Jasmine is currently going through the court system. She has a lot of factors going against her. She has several charges from the past. most of which were due to societal issues such as homelessness, addiction, and lots of support. So she leaned on unhealthy supports, which led her down to a negative road. So her and her lawyer were working on a bail plan. She was going to go to treatment, complete outpatient treatment. She wanted to get reconnected with her culture because that's something that was taken away from her parents, and she wanted to reconnect with and have that support for her unborn child. But because she had no residence that was approvable by the courts and very little positive supports, the courts denied her bail. So she is now looking at being sentenced. For her, this is scary because she's 4 months pregnant, and her lawyer suspects she will get the maximum sentence due to her lengthy criminal record. And she has no way of getting a community sentence because, once again, she doesn't have an address. So Jasmine is struggling. She's trying to find these supports for herself. She's never had that opportunity for her. And so sentencing comes. She's sentenced to 14 months in jail, and she's also placed on a high security unit. So what this looks like is she is allowed to be out of her cell 3 hours a day maximum, and she's very limited into what programming she can complete because due to the high security rating, she can't be with other offenders in the prison. Jasmine is hoping to get out early so that she can parent her baby, but as of right now, when she gives birth, it looks like she will be, her child will be apprehended and placed into the system because there's nowhere for baby to go and mom won't have anywhere to be released to. And Jasmine's starting to feel hopeless because she has so many barriers against her, and she's constantly feeling judged by her past and her family's history, and needs help to overcome them. So with my role working with Jasmine, I am trying to help her find that voice. We are working to find a place for her to go, but because of her history, she keeps getting shut down, which is very frustrating for Jasmine. And so we are working on coming up with a plan so that her baby doesn't end up in the system, but the likelihood of that happening is very high. And this is something I see on a regular basis in our justice system, especially among our Indigenous mothers. So that's a bit of a walkthrough of what the life of Jasmine looks like from being incarcerated at a young age.
Thank you so much, Sydney. Thank you to both of you. You've walked us through quite a lot of complex information in a relatively short period of time, taking us to really the foundations of our society and over an arc of history of our country to where we are today in terms of how people are impacted. We want to open it up for some Q&A. I want to note we are running about 10 minutes ahead of time, or like overtime rather, which is just fine, but it just means we'll have a little less time for questions before we move on to the second part of our workshop. But are there questions and comments? And feel free to jot things in the chat or simply to unmute yourself to pose a question or comment. If there aren't for now, we can also move into the work that the network is doing, and then we'll still have Q&A time at the end of the workshop. Oh, great. Thanks, Jackie, for your comment, for offering many good things to think about. Yeah, it's a lot to digest. I remember some of the first times hearing Becky's educational in particular, to sort of how it's encouraging us to just sort of think so much deeper about what's happening. And yeah, it's a lot for us to digest too. And thank you, Cindy, for sharing the hard story of Jasmine. Yes, Carrie. You're not unmuted, Carrie. Can you unmute yourself?
There you go.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for both your presentations. Excellent, thought-provoking. Becky, I know a lot more information is being brought to elementary and middle schools these days than 10 years ago or 20 years ago, to do with reconciliation and First Nations history. Is your type of information coming into schools at all? The stuff that you're presenting here?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a good question, Carrie. So I believe that there, in pockets, there is anti-racist teachers who are choosing to provide an anti-racist analysis. But I do believe that the public school system in certain areas are looking at incorporating an anti-racist pedagogy, but not large scale. Not large scale.
Yeah.
Well, if the more we keep speaking in forums like this, the more it'll get out there, and maybe that will move ahead as well. Thank you.
Carrie. Florence, did you have a question?
Well, I certainly understand a lot of what's being said, and I've experienced it, and one gets so upset and angry and and you feel like just getting people to come on, listen. but we also have to listen to where the others are coming from. When you've been raised a certain way, when you've been raised to be angry and to be live in a non-violent but violent in a situation where people have been put down, whether it doesn't matter. It doesn't give them the skills to be able to deal with some of these issues. So you're dealing with we have to deal with these issues not just in relation to people of different races, but also of white races, because when I read the stories of some of the white kids that I've had to take into care when I was a social worker, which I did very, very few of. I worked with the families mostly, but their lives were horrendous as well. And so it's not, they don't have the background to be able to show the care and love and compassion and all the things that we value, and so on. So it's a large to help a community to become more humane is a challenge. It was many years ago, and it still is. And we do the best we can and value people who can stand up and say this is wrong, and so on. And so we appreciate people like Carrie and Becky and on and on and on. We've worked a lot with people, related to, walked with, and keep on doing so. And it's challenging, but it's very life-giving as well, because I have many friends from many races: Indigenous, African, South American, Chinese, all around the world. And it's whoever we come in contact with, there's a challenge to be a human being and see the humanity of people. So, and that's all I can say. I don't have I don't have answers except I walk with people, a lot of them.
Thanks very much, Florence. Before we move on to the rest of the workshop, one last question, which came in the chat from Phyllis. Are there group home options for someone like Jasmine, or is there more demand than supply? It's maybe more a question to you, Sydney.
Yeah, so that's a great question. Unfortunately, the demand is far greater than the supply currently. In Saskatoon, our shelter options are Interval House, which is for women fleeing domestic violence. They can go to the Lighthouse or they can go to the YWCA. Unfortunately, all those are usually full. And then group homes, the biggest issue that I run into on a daily basis is they need to have, usually have to have child protection involvement already. So they have to have an open file, which causes a barrier. So there's always a need for it, we're often calling on the government to fund those options as well, which they haven't for the past several years.
One of the things that I think we tend to look at the end too often and we're not ready to work early on in the process. Whether it's, and I find this in people, whether it's, race doesn't come into the issue here. It's if somebody is having a difficult time, we just feel, well, that's their problem. When it's really difficult, that's when the systems kind of come into play, and we need to be have more of that community spirit of supporting each other as a community, and supporting each other on a daily basis, not just when things really go bad. We've had a number of people that have come to us, and they don't fit into the official requirements of a file being open, or a number of other things where people themselves are asking, crying for help, and it's that, to me, is one of the issues that I find sad, is that we could do more preventive work early on, not work, but being human with each other.
Thank you, Florence.
And
it's on that good note of community spirit that we can transition to the next part of the workshop, where we're talking about this network, this group of people who are coming together to work in that spirit. So Becky, why don't you start us off with speaking to the network, and then I think the three of us will share.
Sure, I'll just give a quick overview or kind of background that the Anti-Racism Network, I started working in 2008 with the city of Saskatoon, and back then anti-racism was not widely practiced. It's a very specialized niche, but it is very difficult work to be able to do, especially if you're only one person in a large organization. So at the time, I wanted to create, a group of folks who wanted to address racism within their organizations or within the community. So we started meeting, on a monthly basis to be able to support each other, to talk about racism, to talk about what your organization is doing, what's been successful, what hasn't been successful. And it just started really very, organically, just very informally. And then the George Floyd incident happened, and we were, informed too by, Gerald Stanley being acquitted. And then in 2020, George Floyd really kind of gave life to the Black Lives Matter, not only in the United States, but in Canada. And our membership grew from being, 20 people on a regular basis, to a meeting to 75, 100 people who wanted to know what we were doing and how we were addressing and what was the analysis and what is anti-racism and how can it be helpful. So our small little network grew to be now over 300 people. And from that, we have identified different areas for people who have different interests and expertise to be able to focus. And the Justice League is one of those that are made up of folks who are specifically interested in, policing the courts and corrections. And so Amanda has headed up the Justice League that it's being called. So we've got justice, education, health, art, and governance. And so that's kind of the origins of the network. And we're guided by the work of Verna St. Dennis, who is one of the most, for us anyway, she's a very, very well-known anti-racism practitioner and scholar who has been working in the discipline for over 40 years. So she guides the work that we do, but Amanda heads up the Justice League. And so I think, Amanda, you can provide a little bit more information on what the Justice League has done so far.
Thanks, Becky. But it seemed really wise to me that the network moved to a committee structure once so many people came to the table, because the network so effectively harnessed the energy and the expertise of the people at the table, recognizing that systemic racism is present in a variety of systems and sectors, and so how could the committees could have a more focused look at those areas. And so our Justice Committee started by the summer, and we were a small group of 5 at the time, and the 5 of us had backgrounds in one in policing, myself in courts, another in corrections, and then in public health. And we thought that a good first step would be to write a discussion paper. We specifically framed it as a discussion paper, not a position paper, because we wanted to have an evidence-based approach to this conversation around systemic racism in Saskatchewan's criminal justice system. And so, we pulled the reports and the inquiries and so on, and presented in this paper a discussion about sort of these historical underpinnings of the system, as Becky was speaking to earlier in our session, and identifying the systemic factors that lead to criminalization of particularly Indigenous people, but people of color writ large in Saskatchewan, and the evidence of the disproportionate harm experienced by Indigenous peoples in policing, courts, and corrections. And our little discussion paper, it has some recommendations, which I've sort of just organized on this slide here, some of the key ones. These are our calls for change based on it, one of which is the provision of anti-oppressive education to all justice system actors, secure and sustainable financial investment in community-based networks that support criminalized people. And that's to what you were speaking to, Florence, about how we can support each other in community and having investment in that. Adoption of community policing model and sovereign Indigenous policing was key. Multi-sectoral teams to respond to people in crisis. We see often police intervening when we have a mental health crisis, for example, and criminalizing someone who's hurting, which we heard Stan talk about earlier today. Adoption of restorative justice at the core and not only the fringes of the criminal justice system. This is absolutely crucial, and I think we have a lot of agreement in this circle about that, that the government will say that it values restorative justice, but it's on the fringes, it's underfunded, and the core is still very much a retributive system, and this needs to change. Sustainable funding for alternatives to incarceration, for healing models. Tori spoke about being in a healing lodge, and she's one of the lucky ones, right, who can be in a healing lodge and not in a maximum security facility, and can have some supports towards healing. Sustainable, and then lastly, supports for prisoner reintegration, which of course is the excellent work of our restorative justice partners at MCC. So after writing this discussion paper, our next step was to start having conversations with decision makers in the criminal justice system. Let's have some discussion. And we started reaching out first to other folks working in justice organizations and welcome them to the table. And they came. And so our little group of 5 became a group of 17. Elizabeth Fry, Sydney, and some of her colleagues came to the table. Classic, we heard from Beverly earlier today, some of us in the workshop, who works at Classic. They came, the Community Legal Assistance Services for Saskatoon's inner city. FSIN Justice has come to the table, the John Howard Society, the Law Society of Saskatchewan, the Create Justice organization from the College of Law, U of S, and the Saskatoon Poverty Reduction Partnership. So now we're this like larger group of representatives from justice organizations that are, bring a range of lived experience, seeing how the system is impacting people, and we're now interfacing with decision makers in the criminal justice system. We sit down with leaders with the Saskatoon Police Service, with the RCMP, the Ministry of Justice, who are engaged in a wide sweeping review right now of the criminal justice system in Saskatchewan, and Correctional Services of Canada, who are so engaged in the work that we're doing that we're actually looking at a partnership that will include education and policy change. So the goal of our work is to equip the efforts of leaders in the criminal justice system who are already wanting to address systemic racism. Was in some of these conversations, like particularly with the wardens, one stuck out for me who had, decades of experience. And he said to Becky, he's like, you know what, we've been trying different things for like 30 years and it just hasn't been working. And so it's time for the anti-racism lens. Like it's time to go deeper to like cultural pillars of the system and be promoting those shifts. And so our goal is to equip their efforts and to walk alongside as culture change occurs and is evaluated. And we're encouraged by the receptivity we find and hope to continue journeying with them. And so Sydney's got more to share about the work. And then we'll move to the Q&A. Sydney has the prettiest slides. These last ones are so nice. Just heightening our anticipation, Sydney.
There we go. There we go. Okay. So a bit about the work that we've been doing. So like Amanda and Becky said, the Justice League came to be in the summer of 2020. And their first form of action was to write a paper on systematic racism in the justice system. And this has led to several conversations with community organizations as well as members of these different systems. So since October, when this paper was published, we have had sit-down meetings with City Council, with the province, as well as the federal government. So in February of 2021, we composed a letter detailing information about how things could have gone differently after there was a death of a woman who had been released from Pine Grove Correctional Center, which is just north of PA. And so we wrote this paper because we felt that there was a better way for our federal government to handle the policy regarding policing or regarding releases, and then as well as how our city could make calls for action from our provincial government. So this letter then led to a sit down with the Mayor, Charlie Clark, where a few of our members sat down and had a conversation about systemic injustices at both a municipal and provincial level, and gave suggestions on what could be done. One of which was for our municipal government to bring a voice to the racism that's happening in our province. Unfortunately, we were told that the city is doing what they can to address racism. So while we didn't get the answer we wanted, it did open the door to continue working with the city. And then in April, we met with members of Saskatoon Police Service to discuss a position that they have called Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Officer. So we were able to discuss what this position will look like. And SPS has welcomed continue to work together on this project. And I believe we do have a meeting set up in the near future to discuss the rollout of this position. In May, we met with the Director of First Nation and Métis Services with the Provincial Ministry of Corrections. And we were taught about an anti-racism component of their training, that they are creating a focus on using anti-racism practices with Indigenous offenders. The director did state that they are working on changing the lens to be a more anti-racism lens rather than what they've been doing previously. So that was positive, and it's opened up those conversations for us to continue working with the Ministry of Corrections. In June, we were able to sit down with the federal Prairie Region executives. And again, we talked about what is the federal government doing to address racism in our prisons. It was clear that there are lots of work for them to be doing to address racism. And we continue to plan to offer them support and education, as well as build that relationship. Shortly after, we were invited to discuss on a panel to discuss anti-racism concepts. And this presentation went really well. Many wanted more information afterwards. In September, we learned that the federal government is creating an anti-racism dashboard, and the Anti-Racism Network has developed an 80-hour anti-racism module that the federal government will potentially be using in their training for their staff. So that was encouraging to see that from our conversations that we've had with the federal government members, that change is slowly influencing policy. And so that brings us to today, where we have follow-up meetings planned with the federal corrections, Saskatoon policing, as well as members from the University of Saskatchewan to discuss how we can continue to work together to create a community where we are using an anti-racism lens to address justice issues. And that's everything.
Thank you so much, Sydney. Appreciate the detail that you just brought to the work that we're doing. And so we have 10 minutes left in our workshop before we move into the closing session. So we have time for questions and comments. And I encourage people to pop them in the chat or simply unmute yourself to pose them.
Yeah, I have a question, and I think it's for Becky. I'm all for doing what can be done to discover policies that discriminate and work toward changing them. At the same time, I saw on one of your slides the statement to work for equality of outcome. And I'm just wondering about that statement. Isn't it, I know we're looking for equality of opportunity, but if we look for equality of outcome, then shouldn't we have the same number of prisoners between the ages of 70 and 80, like I am, in a prison as between 20 and 30?
Well, I would like to see having no prisoners.
Right.
So I'm not sure if I understand your question, but what If we are going to, I guess, no, what I would certainly not want to propose that, that we should try and increase the amount of incarceration for folks who are not equally represented as Indigenous people.
Yeah, let me just qualify again what I'm saying, maybe a little bit in terms of justice. If we see justice as that good behavior is rewarded and bad behavior is, I guess you could say, punished, maybe we have to look at how we define good behavior or bad behavior, or maybe we have to look at how we define punishment. And like you said earlier, the types of consequences for negative behavior might be different or in a more healing way. And I think I kind of got that from your presentation.
And I think part of the conversation that we need to take into consideration is the circumstances that people are in that perpetuate, a propensity to negative behavior. And that is a conversation that is outside of just the justice system alone. And I think that it's an important one that needs to be able to be had. Because the existence of the justice system and the outcomes that it produces is not solely an outcome or an effect of the justice system alone. And so it's important to be able to have that wider conversation about what are the circumstances and the policies that exist that produce to these outcomes within the justice system. So it isn't the justice system's responsibility alone to address that, even though it is important to continue to have those conversations among justice system practitioners, which I prefer to call it a legal system as opposed to a justice system. But yes, those are, I think, important conversations to have, but also to remember that it isn't in isolation the justice system that produces those outcomes. It's society as a whole. Does that in answer to your question, I guess, or to the comment in terms of the statement that was in one of the slides?
Yeah, I think that helps me some. I guess I have some problem with the term equality of outcome.
I see what you're saying, and I guess we're looking, of equitable representation, and we can look at, positive outcomes as important as the negative ones. So we know that if there is more equitable outcomes, or if there's more equality in the outcomes that we see within the justice system, we can then therefore assume that there is probably more equitable outcomes in the amount of Indigenous people who are graduating from high school, because they're not in jail, they're actually graduating from high school. So I'm not sure whether or not, we can assume that without doing any type of, research into the evidentiary body. But I think that it's safe to say that in producing equal outcomes in incarceration means that we are then also hoping to be able to do the same work within, justice systems and child welfare systems and education systems that address that overrepresentation.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Dan and Becky. Other questions or comments?
I think I would just say, I think from what I've heard in here is just like, have we really thought, are we intentional to think enough about what we mean by the word justice, especially when you have different cultures and people groups, because you can really misunderstand each other. And perhaps it's possible that if we could learn together about it, that we could come up with a more holistic concept of justice that we could try to understand as we try to share, a land together. So that's kind of a little bit what I heard.
Thanks for that, Jackie. Such a good invitation. Any other questions or comments? It's also okay if we end a little early right before the closing and have a few-minute break.
Thank you, Amanda, and everybody else.
Nancy, Nancy, did you have a question or comment?
All I wanted to say was thank you, Amanda, for your work and for moderating, and to Becky and Sydney for the wonderful presentation. And it is exciting to end on, you know, we started off with all of the dreariness of, yeah, we know there's racism, but we don't know how to fix it. And then you gave us this hopefulness. Yes, there's work, but you gave us some hope. I feel good about that.
Beautiful. Thank you, Nancy, for helping us end on that note of hope as well. This is the work of us all. Well, I just want to thank Becky and Sydney so much for joining us and for sharing with us. And maybe we can do some like applause, Zoom applause for you, as we'd want to warmly thank you. We're all in a room together. So we so appreciate you sharing your expertise, your perspective, and for co-laboring on these issues together. So we've got a 2-minute break before our closing starts.